Welcome to Breaking the Narrative, a Stand With Us Canada podcast. I'm your host, Jesse Primorano, and in each episode, we'll dive into the fight against anti-Semitism and the delegitimization of Israel. From student leaders to community advocates, we'll explore how people are standing up and making a difference. New episodes drop every other Thursday, so let's get into this week's conversation. Welcome back to another episode of Breaking the Narrative, a Stand With Us Canada podcast. I'm your host, Jesse Primorano, and thrilled to be joined today by Michael Hollander. Michael is a Montreal-based lawyer and founding and managing partner at Choueke Hollander LLP in Montreal. But more importantly, for the context of this conversation, Michael has been part of a team along with Neil Oberman and I know a few others who have been leading the charge in Canada, specifically in Montreal, in supporting students and making sure that they're fully protected by the laws of their province, of this country, and doing his part to defend our students in a way that not many others can. Michael, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Jesse.
It's a pleasure. It's a really great opportunity not just to amplify your voice and to help the community understand, what's at our disposal and how we can protect ourselves legally, but also an opportunity for people to see what goes on behind the scenes. As I'm sure we'll talk about today, so much of legal work is done, behind the scenes, in the shadows, not something that's, typically public info until things are concluded. And I think it's really important for people to understand the inner workings of all of this, what our lawyers are working on, what they're looking for, and in many cases, how our community can support them and our students a little bit better. So would love just to start with a little bit about you, Michael. I mean, obviously you're a practicing lawyer. I know your practice is still going on despite the time you've invested in our students, but what, beyond the obvious, what drove you to commit so much of your time and to spend so much of your energy focusing on our students the last couple of years?
Basically, in terms of what specific instance drove me, post October 7th, I like to say that I have an empathy problem. The events of October 7th really blew me away. I spent around 2-3 weeks really pretty much in the dumps afterwards, and didn't really know how to focus a lot of what I was feeling. Ultimately, I actually went one day and asked my rabbi at Chabad of Westmount, what do I do about this? What can I do about this? And he basically told me something really simple. He just said, loud and proud. And a few days later, a gentleman, a lawyer that I know for a long time by the name of Neil Oberman, called me and asked me if I would help him write a letter to Dawson College here in Montreal over some anti-Semitic incidents that were happening on campus post-October 7th. I said yes, and here I am, basically afterwards.
And I think it's really fascinating because, a lot of people have asked their rabbis that question, what can I do? And, the answer often is loud and proud, but in what way? And I try to tell people all the time, you don't have to have a particular skill set to find something meaningful that you can do to make a difference in this post-October 7th world. But particularly those with professional skill sets like yours, it's critical that people sort of find at least a little bit of their time. Nobody can give as much as you have in many cases, but to give a little bit of their time to say, what is it about my skill set that can help? I have mental health professionals that have come to work with our students, executive training and professional coaches that have come to help our staff become better leaders for their students. There's a way for everyone to fit in, and for you it's quite obvious, but I guess what probably wasn't quite as obvious to you maybe until October 7th, or maybe it was, and you can tell me, is the type of discrimination that Jewish students were actually facing on their campuses. What does that look like in practice from somebody who understands it through the legal lens? What's the difference between the type of discrimination that Jews and pro-Israel students have experienced and what we maybe would have seen before October 7th?
So one thing, I'm a commercial lawyer. I do business law. I'm typically the lawyer that you call to do your lease or to consult with about your mortgage or to, let's say, kick out your tenant if he's not paying his rent. Okay, that's typically what I do. I don't have a background in doing university or school law or in doing human rights. Okay, I sort of learned as we went along. Okay, what I've seen though, it's a very different landscape today than when I went to university. When I went to law school 20-something years ago, we were taught about the Charter of Rights and how, the rule of law. and how the law is supposed to be applied equally and the rules are all supposed to be applied equally. And then 5-6 years ago, we saw this concept pop up called DEI, right? And so that basically, without really going into it, I don't want to go into such a controversial topic, but it seems that it sort of led to different treatment for different types of people, okay? And so really all the main difference is that the rules don't seem to be applied equally to Jewish, or I'll use the term very loosely, Zionist students, as opposed to everybody else. I've seen that happen many times. But essentially, when Jewish and or Zionist students started speaking up to the effect that their concerns over what was happening on campus were ignored or were not being really met, it was really met with almost a deafening silence from a lot of school administrations. And I've seen this. So in Quebec, we have a different sort of system. You finish high school in grade 11, and then you go into a system called CEGEP, which is a 2-year program and sort of like a pre-university. Okay, there's different schools. And then you go into university, right? So you can get your degree here in 3 years instead of in 4, at least for an undergrad, okay? And so we saw this happening pretty much in most of the English CEGEPs, some of the French ones, although the Jewish community here tends to congregate more in the English ones, and in the university context at McGill, Concordia, a little bit of Université de Montréal, but mostly at McGill and Concordia. And it was pretty much the same reaction, just in different schools.
The same reaction, you mean being no reaction at all?
Basically platitudes saying we support you, we're listening to you, we're hearing you, but it was never actually met with any concrete action items that would actually fix the problem.
And I'm sure in many cases the initial communication had suggested action items and requested next steps that were, I guess, just cast aside. And I think that's the most frustrating part that people really need to understand here, is that we're like the first marginalized group in history who has been told that A, they don't get to define their own pain, and B, that sorry, there's not much we can do about it. Like, I would even venture to guess that many of those letters and communications you got back from the schools mentioned, anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, I'm sure, at risk of being perceived to not care about the other side. It feels like people can't sympathize with us without sympathizing, with others, which has sort of put us into this box. So,
yeah.
So what does that look like in practice for you? Do these schools, first of all, have a legal obligation that they're not meeting, or are they skirting it somehow and we're just sort of stuck dealing with it, or what does it actually look like in practice?
So part of the problem actually is that the legal obligations, at least here, are not very well defined. Okay, like the government of Quebec actually recently came out with a report on, let's say, problematic behavior in 2 CEGEPs at Dawson College and Vanier College. Okay, those are basically the 2 CEGEPs that are the most frequented by members of the Jewish community here. Okay, and one of the things they identified is issues with this concept of academic freedom. Okay, it's basically now being used as a cover to justify pretty much anything, any viewpoint, what's taught in the classroom, what kind of messaging is given in the school. I could give you a few, specific examples, but I've had students come to me, for example, with course content that is viewed as not necessarily discriminatory, but let's say that promotes a hateful agenda, okay? And when those concerns are raised to the administration, the response, to the extent that there's even a response at all, is essentially cloaking itself in academic freedom. Problem is, there's no real definition or limits to academic freedom. So, we have a complicated legal, let's say, framework here in Canada with the charters, okay, the 2 charters that do impose restrictions. Both Quebec and Canadian charters impose restrictions on things like freedom of expression. The restrictions typically need to be justified in a free and democratic society, but unfortunately, that's a very subjective term, right? So it seems like sometimes, unfortunately, it's cherry picked based on who's the one making the complaint.
And do you think that goes back again to this sort of, I know not to dive into this conversation too deeply, but with DEI, this oppressor versus oppressed narrative, do you think it's exclusively that we're on this list of oppressors? Because I know that we're not the only ones on that list. Or do you think it's something specific to the Jewish people that goes beyond the depths of DEI?
So I'm not a DEI expert, but it's still not clear to me who's on the list and who's not on the list.
Well, Christians are on the list also. Whites are on the list. Like, there's a lot of folks who, like, it would not be acceptable to, to target Christian places of worship in the way that Jewish institutions have been targeted without any kind of recourse. So actually, you know what? Let's pivot there for a second.
Actually, Jesse, the best thing I could tell you on this, okay, is that the same message that was seen as abhorrent in or around 2020 during the Black Lives Matter movement, anybody who said all lives matter was criticized. Well, that same messaging is then what's being redirected back to the members of our community who are suffering, these issues, in the sense that, we see you, we hear you, we condemn all forms of hate, right? All forms, except that this form of hate is a very specific one, okay? And by the way, whether you target it in virtue of our charters here, okay? So as Jews, you're protected by freedom of religion. You're protected from discrimination, not just by religion, but also by ethnic origin. And Zionism, okay, is also, it's a political opinion. It's a political view, which is also supposed to be protected from discrimination.
Yeah. Which it's not. I mean, like, it's, as we know, I don't have to tell you that, but I think, I was just sort of thinking while you were talking that it's an interesting dichotomy, because what I'm hearing you saying is that the other side, like our opposition, is saying all lives matter, right? To our, Jewish lives matter. But at the same time, we're expected as Jews or as Zionists to hold that all lives matter belief the other way, that if we say, Judaism, Jewish people, October 7th, well, what about the victims of Gaza? What about the victims of, so it feels sort of like the narrative works for them when it works and doesn't work for them when it doesn't. And it makes it feel almost like a lost cause in many ways. But I guess that's neither here nor there. I'm curious to talk about protections in the community. So we'll come back to campus in a second, but we were sort of talking about the unwillingness of government to protect our institutions. I know that you guys had an injunction that was, granted in Montreal or in Quebec. And I know in many cases that injunction was not enforced by the police, by local law enforcement, including at our event with Elon Levy in Montreal. Curious where you think we have the opportunity to take a step further legally. Like, have we exhausted all of our resources there? And if the police don't want to enforce it, the police don't want to enforce it? Or is there something that we could be doing, if there was more of a collaborated effort, perhaps, I don't know, to make sure that the police in our cities are actually protecting us the way that they need to be?
So there's a legal, first of all, that's really a technical legal question. The best way I could frame it is that there is a legal argument to the effect that civil injunctions don't necessarily bind the police. I'm not going to say whether I agree with it or don't agree with it on the podcast, but the essentialism is that sometimes what we did here, unfortunately, was trying to apply a legal solution to a political problem. Okay, and the reality is that it probably won't change until the political issue is fixed, okay? Now, what is that political problem? We could probably have a podcast just on that, okay?
Definitely.
But the reality is, I'm sure you've heard of the concept of bubble legislation, right?
Yep.
Okay. Personally, I've gone on record, you can even check my Instagram, I am not a fan of bubble legislation, okay? Because hateful, harassing, and intimidating conduct is already illegal under the criminal code. Okay, disrupting a religious service, for example, outside of a synagogue is already illegal under the criminal code. Supporting terrorism, for example, is already illegal under the criminal code. Okay, the main problem, and when I say political, is not necessarily that we don't have proper laws to treat those issues, including the one that affected your event. Okay, the main problem is that the existing laws aren't being enforced.
So it's institutional resistance basically to enforcing the law, right? That we have levels of government at all levels, it seems, who are sort of unwilling to direct the police to enforce the law. Is that something you'd feel comfortable saying?
No, because the police are supposed to be independent of, for example, the municipal authorities. Okay.
So tell me. Sorry, go ahead.
So I'm actually not comfortable saying that because the reality is that I don't know. Okay. I'm not in those offices. I'm not with them. I'm basically my own person who represents my own clients. Okay. The best I can tell you is that there clearly is an enforcement problem. The police have their own, let's say, guidelines and protocols in terms of how to deal with things like the demonstrations that we've seen on the streets for the last 2 years. Anybody can have an opinion over whether those protocols are sufficient or not. But the reality is that, in my view, there's a lot of behavior that is illegal that goes on at these demonstrations. That isn't necessarily enforced. But I'm not in the offices of the SPVM to say what their policies are or whether they're appropriate or not. The reality is that they still continue. They go on pretty much unchallenged, and the police are there. And by the way, the police do a fantastic job for the most part of keeping the peace. Even at your event, by the way, nobody was injured, nobody was hurt. It's really, I think, more of a dignity issue at the end of the day, because those injunctions were rendered for a reason. And ultimately, they were meant also to keep those demonstrators from 50 meters from the synagogues, for example, for a reason. And you could argue that the dignity of the people who attended that event was affected.
It certainly was. I mean, listen, I had elderly people that were concerned about leaving the building that night, that didn't feel safe walking back to their cars. I mean, to me, that's the definition of dignity being affected. And I guess,
but Jesse, in terms of safety, okay, I really have no qualms in terms of how at least the police here act in terms of keeping us safe. Okay, they do their job to keep us safe.
I agree with that, and I would say the same thing for the record about Toronto and about Vancouver and some of the other cities that I've had the pleasure of working with the police. I would say, at large, definitely the police have been a friend to the Jewish community through this last 2 years. I think where I struggle is to see, blatant criminal activity, being exhibited in our streets, in many cases right in front of police. Same thing with at our universities, right? Writing to request like basic protections from our university and basic understanding of our Jewish and pro-Israel experience. And it just feels like everywhere we turn, there's this, I said it before, I like the way I phrased it, institutional resistance, that there's this unwillingness to be the ones to sort of go against the mob and to speak up. Do you feel like that sort of is what it comes down to, is a fear of like the social consequences more than anything else?
I could give you an actual good example of that, but yes, I actually would agree with you on that. It's not even necessarily a resistance, because it's more like a lack of resistance. Okay, so
well said.
Canada in general, okay, is known for being, let's say, a relatively complacent country. Okay, where let's say a small group of very aggressive activists get their way. Oftentimes against, let's say, the wishes and positions of the majority. Okay, so if you ask most regular people on the street, whether they agree with, let's say, the type of behavior that they often see, they'll say no. Okay, but the reality is that there's very little resistance to that type of aggressive behavior, mostly because what I found is that most Canadians don't like conflict. Okay, they tend to not want to be drawn into conflict, and oftentimes it's not worth it. Okay, for them in their personal lives, for their careers, for their well-being, it's not worth it to be drawn into a conflict. Now, for me, I'm okay. I'm a litigator for 18 years. Okay, I live in conflict, so there's different types of conflict that different types of people are comfortable with. But typically what I found is that, he who pushes the hardest, or he or she who pushes the hardest, okay, tends to get the better results. And oftentimes, we try to push as hard as we can. But, myself and, the lawyers that I work with, notably Neil, are, we're very few people, right? So On the other end of things, let's say on the other side, you have people who are very motivated, very loud, very aggressive, and they tend to just push the administrations and the public in general harder than we do.
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess it's one of those things that's just the unfortunate reality that there's really not much to say about the numbers game behind all of this. That like even when you take away the support that's grown and the people that have sort of failed to think critically and to realize sort of what side of this issue they're falling onto, there is like a sheer numbers game just based on the cultural backgrounds of people who support Israel versus support the Palestinian people that we're losing, which is why I commend you, because I think that a lot of people think, oh, this is sort of like a mountain that's impossible to climb and I have other things to focus on, but we do have to kind of just chip away one little bit at a time and to remind them all that we're sort of here and we're not going anywhere. And I think that for students who are on campus, who some of which are very involved, whether it's in like a club like Startup Nation or Hillel or Chabad, whatever it might be, they're there every day on the forefront of this battleground, specifically in Montreal. And I think that even as much as we like to pride ourselves at Stand With Us Canada on our ability to, to meet with universities, to do public awareness campaigns, to put pressure on them in other ways through the media, through social media, unfortunately, that doesn't carry weight in most cases anymore, and we need to fall back on the law. The law is sort of our saving grace in saying like, look, there are still today at least words that exist on paper somewhere that should protect us. The unfortunate truth is that very few people know how to advocate for Israel and to have these difficult conversations about Israel. But even fewer people know the law and the extent of the law to which, practicing lawyers understand it. So I guess my first question for you is, a big part of why I wanted to have you here today was, especially as we're going back to school now this month, I want to talk about, like in brass tacks, what this experience is like for students. And so the first question, I guess, would be, how would a student sort of know in the first place if their rights have been violated, if there is something that warrants, calling a lawyer? Because I'll be honest with you, I get an email once a day asking for legal support, and I would say, honestly, it's 50-50. 50% of the time it's, oh yeah, better put this to a lawyer immediately. And the other 50, it's like, well, I asked my professor if I could do a presentation in class and he said no. And it's like, well, was anyone else doing a presentation? And she's like, no. And it's like, okay, well then there's like, that sounds pretty reasonable to me. And so it's tough for people because I think especially nowadays we feel discriminated against just by walking down the street when somebody looks at us the wrong way because they see our Magen David. So we're naturally in this protective nature, this protective state, which makes sense. So anyways, I'll end this long-winded rant and just ask, how can students and their parents and families identify when it might be the right time to call a lawyer, to call us?
So calling a lawyer should always be a last resort, okay? Schools have their own complaint process. They have their own disciplinary process when it comes to conduct by students and by teachers and by staff. Okay, the lawyer typically should be the last result because typically when you go to court, okay, one of the first things that you're asked is, well, did your client follow the internal process that was applicable to the situation? Okay, so it really shouldn't be a reflex to call a lawyer. Okay. But and there's also no like catch-all, sort of scenario that I could give you as to when it's appropriate to even file a disciplinary or a complaint in general with either the administration or the student union or whatever. Okay, it's all case by case. Okay, it could range from let's say being mistreated at school by a fellow student. It could range from having an event on campus canceled, having your tabling canceled. I think a year and a half ago, for example, the Hillel students at Concordia got blockaded in their room, okay, by a loud, angry mob of students banging at the door and basically stalking them. Okay, who do you complain to for that, right? But the reality is that all the administrations and the student unions have an internal complaint process that first should be followed. Step one of doing that, though, okay, as a student, is actually filing the complaint. Okay, I could maybe give you. I can't give them to you because they're private, but I think I've heard at least 100 times of how once when students are given the opportunity to file the complaint, they typically choose not to because again they don't want problems, and that's okay. It's a personal decision to decide whether whether you as a student want to go down that route. Okay, it's a decision in a lot of senses because not doing anything about it will pretty much just guarantee that it continues. But not everybody wants to do that. I can't tell you the amount of letters that Neil and I have written on behalf of anonymous students, okay, who rightly or wrongly didn't want to put their names to things, okay, for fear of reprisals by the school, for fear of reprisals by other students. It's a really tough situation and it's very personal. So, that's the reality. We've still managed to get results even on behalf of anonymous students, okay, but that's the reality that students face today. I actually read an article just this morning in the National Post about how a majority of university students who were surveyed here said that they're actually afraid to publicly disclose their views, okay? Notably their political views on controversial topics, which to me, as a former university student, is insane because when I was in law school at U of Ottawa, I was actually known for typically just going off on whatever controversial topic of the day there was and like freely expressing it. So I would tell you that, a free society that has that restriction on people is really not a free society.
Yeah, and this is the problem, right? Is that we've created, that's what universities used to be. Universities used to be a breeding ground for free thought and innovative ideas and conceptualization. Unfortunately, now it's become if you don't fit into the prevailing viewpoint, you're ostracized, you're othered, you're now demonized from the campus community. And I think it's really unfortunate. You're canceled. And exactly. So this is what this cancel culture has brought to the forefront. Again, the idea of cancel culture in the first place was to say to people who had, unfortunate or inappropriate opinions that, hey, your opinion isn't welcome here. But do you think that changed the person's mind? Do you think anyone ever had their mind changed because they were canceled? No, it just firmly emboldened them further into their viewpoint. And so, look, I don't need to spend too much time talking about why cancel culture is dangerous, but right now where we find ourselves is this place where students are, like you said, there have been so many other categories of crime over the years where victims have been afraid to come forward out of fear of their own abuser. And it feels like that's the case right now with Jewish students. And so I do respect your stance, and I agree with it that if somebody chose not to submit a complaint or to submit it anonymously, look, I respect everyone's right to self-preservation and safety. But I do think, I would just say, I do think it's incumbent on us to raise our voices and to speak up and to do, if you can find the strength, the koach to do it. We need the universities to understand the depths of these problems and to have these reports come in.
That's the whole thing, right? Because as the lawyers, okay, the lawyers are only the mouthpieces for clients, okay? Without a client, we're nothing. We're not advocates, we're activists, and that's not what I do, okay? I'm an advocate for people. I'm a service provider. Okay, I handle the operations of letting that person use their voice, and for example, we've taken lawsuits on behalf of students where they have put their names to it. Okay, and these are also students who are less concerned with let's say being liked or being popular than with being respected, and I think that's also a really important distinction. Is that a lot of people, particularly from our community, need to get over the desire, let's say, to be liked in society and just settle at this point for being respected.
So I'll actually take that a step further and say, boldly probably, that I think the greatest mistake the Jewish community ever made was post-World War II, when we found ourselves emigrating all over the world, arriving in these new countries and saying okay, well, in the last country I was in, I was proudly Jewish and look where it got me. So now the best bet is to assimilate, to fit in, to cause as little trouble as possible, and then they won't hate me as much for being Jewish. And we spent decades just trying to fit in, trying to just be Canadian rather than to be Jewish or to be Jewish Canadian. And I would argue, honestly, again, it's hard to tell somebody this because you never know how each individual situation plays out. But in the big picture, we are stronger and safer by foregoing this concern of like, well, if I submit this report, maybe my professor will take retribution or some students will target me. It's like that may happen, but like you said, Michael, they'll also respect you a lot more for standing up for what you believe in, and they maybe won't mess with you the next time because they know that you're gonna, like, even if it is like, look, we talk about, as a kid, you're told, don't be a tattletale. Then you get to be in your 20s. It's don't be a snitch. But at the end of the day, this is violation of human rights, and we share this planet together. And people need to be empowered to speak up when their human rights are violated.
So even when I grew up, okay, the general message for how to deal with bullies was to ignore them, to show empathy to them, okay, to sort of understand it from their point of view. It's a problem with them, okay. And I actually do agree with showing empathy to anybody, okay? Even the person that's hating on you, okay? To me, it really says more about them than it says about the person being hated on, okay? And you should show empathy to absolutely everybody. But I don't agree necessarily with turning away or turning the other cheek from bullies. Like, the only way to really deal with a bully is to deal with it.
No questions asked. Yeah, we have to deal with it in a way that we haven't been. And I think we're starting to get to that tipping point now where people are realizing, we really need to step up. So I'm curious to hear from you what that looks like in practice. Like, we've talked a little bit about like writing demand letters. I know you can't talk about active cases, and I know that these also take a long time to resolve themselves. So I'm not sure how many have concluded at this point, but I guess I'd be curious just to ask, what other legal tools besides, demand letters, like what else are at the disposal of these students, and I guess a bigger question as a follow-up would be, have you seen anything change? Have you seen like any kind of meaningful shift in legislation or policy or anything like that as a result of something that you guys have done, that maybe the rest of us can follow suit in other provinces around the country?
I think that the injunctions that Neil and I took for the Jewish community definitely helped spur the conversation on bubble legislation. Okay,
they did for sure. As a third party observer in another province, that was the beginning of that conversation. Which I'd be curious also after to hear because you said you're pro injunction and less pro bubble legislation. So curious to hear sort of what the middle ground is, if I'm understanding you correctly.
Well, the reality is that I think it's sad that private citizens and institutions had to go and defend themselves to do something that the authorities should have done for them. That's part of that social contract. Okay, now that situation that resulted in the injunctions was an actual public safety incident. Okay, like the doors to the building in question on March 4th, 2024 were blocked. People couldn't get out of the building. Okay, that was a real issue. Okay, and that was also an issue, again, still of enforcement. Okay. So that's why I'm not sure what bubble legislation is going to solve, okay? But you see, as the situation has evolved since then, I mean, there's more of a conversation now happening, in particular in government, federally, about doing more to help the Jewish community and more to protect the Jewish community. But at the end of the day, okay, like, we're citizens of this country, okay? I'm not saying for all the students, but like people like, you and I, we pay taxes, okay? There's a social contract that's incumbent in those taxes, and a big part of that contract is basic safety, okay? We have the right to that. We also have the right to be treated with respect. No one says that we have to be liked, okay? You would hope that, that you are. Obviously, no one wants to be hated. But, you still have the right to be treated with respect as a citizen of this country, regardless of whether you're a business person, a homeless person, or a student. Okay, you have that right. So in terms of the change so far, we're seeing a lot of it in conversation. We're not seeing a lot of it, unfortunately, in terms of tangible action. But I think the message that that file, the injunctions file sent, was that our community will stand up for itself and our community will come together and stick up for itself. And I think that was an important message to send. In terms of some of the other proceedings that I've taken or that I participated in, it's been more or less the same. I had a file, actually, this is public record, so I could discuss it with you. In December, the Concordia Student Union actually tried to kick Startup Nation out of the student union. Okay, they tried to remove their club status. In doing it, they violated. I don't remember the number off the top of my head, but definitely more than 4 of their own policies and bylaws in doing it. Okay, we took that injunction. It actually wasn't granted. They actually they filed an undertaking through their lawyers to not proceed with it. Okay. But that sent also the message that our students wouldn't tolerate that kind of behavior and wouldn't tolerate these things happening to them. And, were there other incidents on campus since then? Absolutely. There was one the following month with a meeting actually that had about close to 900 students voting in favor of a BDS resolution. Our students were outvoted something like 800 and I think close to 890 to like 46. Okay. But credit to those 46 students who still showed up. Okay. Who took that abuse and who stood up for themselves. And in doing that, defended not only themselves, but their community.
This is Concordia you're talking about?
At Concordia, yeah.
Yeah, so we had Drew Silver on the podcast a couple of months ago, and he talked about that meeting and the difficulty, of sitting in there as like what feels like the only Zionist in the world. There are 45 others in the room, even with you, but in a crowd like that and that hostile, it feels like you're the only one, and it requires, an immense amount of courage. But I think you're right. It all speaks to that same theme of, we're here, we're proud, we're not going anywhere. And we would just like a little bit of respect. We'd like our voices to be heard. And so it sounds like there's been a lot of great stuff. Obviously, like we know here from our office in Toronto, we have staff in Montreal, we have students in Montreal. So like we've seen like these, between the injunctions and the complaints, there's been meaningful change made. I was thrilled last year. I'm trying to remember, you probably know exactly what I'm talking about, but it was a Jewish holiday and there was some sort of commemoration taking place outside, and the protesters had, 50 feet, I guess. They were held back by the injunction. And you look at the pictures from that day and it's like, it's sad to say what a win it felt like, but to be able to say, okay, look, here are these Jewish and pro-Israel students commemorating whatever it was they were commemorating, and being able to do so in relative peace was really special. And so it's been great to see the work that you guys have done and the differences that you've been able to make. I'm curious to hear like sort of future perspective of, like, I know you like you said, your work only goes as far as the students or the clients will take you, but from a legislation standpoint, what do you think needs to change next? What do we need to focus on as Canadians, specifically Canadians with legal credentials? What do we need to try to see change to feel more protected?
So, I'm not sure necessarily in terms of legislation. Definitely, the criminal code definition of anti-Semitism needs to be expanded. I'm not even saying it needs to be expanded to IHRA, but it needs to be expanded beyond just Holocaust denial. Okay? There needs to be more education, notably for the authorities, as to what anti-Semitism actually is, okay? How it is a form of racism, okay, and discrimination. They need to be taught how to see the signs of anti-Semitism, and also more resources need to be allocated, okay? And I believe, actually, Anthony Housefather was petitioned for this, okay, to his credit, okay? But, definitely the things that he's proposed need to be adopted 100%. I'm not even saying no to bubble legislation. I don't think it's effective, but it definitely can't hurt. Okay. So in terms of the recommendations that came out from his Justice Committee report in December of 2024, those definitely need to be adopted. More prosecutors who are specialized in hate crimes need to be hired, given the proper tools to actually prosecute. Okay. And like a lot of things in our society right now, our public services aren't in the best of shape. Okay. But more resources need to be poured into the courts. Okay. Our justice system is typically chronically underfunded as it is. Okay. Our prosecutors are, at least here in Quebec, are tremendously overworked and under-resourced. They need to be given the proper resources to deal with a lot of crimes, not just hate crimes, more effectively. And essentially, people who engage in hateful and or criminal behavior, need to understand and need to see tangibly that there's consequences for that. Okay, like the concept of accountability needs to be restored, and it needs to be done even-handedly.
I agree. I agree. Michael, for the sake of time, I want to just pivot a little bit, and I want to ask you about like I want to just go a step backwards, if we may. So we talked about how first things first, file the complaints with the right bodies, and we can help you with that. So for example, you're a student at U of T, McGill, whatever it is. You don't know where to start with this complaint process, reach out to us at Stand With Us and allow us to help you with that. We have a breakdown of every university across the country, their reporting procedures, and how to make that happen. Should that go nowhere, and should that not be dealt with appropriately, we will and can connect you with lawyers in your province, in your city, that can help you deal with this. But then when it comes to dealing with it, I guess, I don't know, Michael, I feel like you've already shared. Is there any more insight that you can give us as to what that looks like and how to, I guess the other question I wanted to ask you is, how does the average 19 or 20-year-old student know if their human rights have been violated or not? Like, what's the measurement for that? How can they test that? How does that look like in practice?
In practice, it goes towards, typically it's honestly something you feel more than what you see. Okay. Mm-hmm. But it's in testing if you're being treated the same way as someone else, let's say, who's not like you. Okay. That's pretty much the definition of discrimination. It's unequal treatment.
Yeah. So that's a really simple answer, and I think that's the problem, is things get lost in the mud sometimes. Like, you need to ask yourself, does this seem like something that would happen to somebody else? And how many times have we said, there's no other community that would be treated this way or would be expected to endure this type of behavior. So if you feel that way, not you being Michael, you being the students, we need you to speak up. We need you to stand up, be counted, be proud, and make an effort to make your voice heard and have the school make a change. Because I think, like you've said, Michael, we've seen the impacts of it, and it's really important for us to make those strides.
There's definitely been incremental change. It definitely doesn't come as fast as I'm sure anyone else would like to see. But there's definitely going to be no change by doing nothing. Okay. Neil, actually, I'll rip off his line here. Okay. He's been saying from the very beginning of this that if you do nothing, you get nothing. But if you do something, you might get something. Okay.
Yep. And well said, Neil.
Exactly. So typically, I subscribe to the same theory, and this is something, by the way, that I've counseled my clients on in my regular practice forever. Okay. Sometimes there is a benefit in doing nothing. Okay. Sometimes a situation can play itself out without you even having to do anything. Okay. Yep. But you definitely won't have any impact on the situation by doing nothing.
I'll quote somebody in my life here who said, I'm actually going to butcher this now, but it's very similar. It's that you'll never regret doing something, but you'll regret doing nothing. You know what I mean? Like, if you try and fail, fine, but you'll regret sitting there and sitting on your hands, and watching the way things unfold.
Look, typically a good lawyer will be able to vet, let's say an issue with legs versus a frivolous complaint. Okay. Mm-hmm. Honestly, like staff on campus should also be able to make that distinction.
Well, that's what I was going to say to you, is we can make that distinction, right? And we can tell students, this is sort of something that we can deal with internally, and we can work with media, whatever. But yeah, it's the first thing is speaking up. The first thing is sort of I think really understanding that. That's the simple test. Do you think this would have happened if it was somebody else in my shoes, not me?
Exactly. Once you've basically separated the wheat from the chaff, and I'm not saying that there's no chaff. Okay, I get a lot of people calling me with a lot of different issues, and sometimes I can help them, sometimes I can't. Okay, or sometimes it's not something that rises to the level of anti-Semitism or anything like that. But typically, you can't make the situation any worse by doing something about it. At the worst, you won't get a positive result, but you're not going to make it worse.
And I also want to just say, for anyone who fears, retribution from future employers or anything of that nature, believe me, there are plenty of employers who value, pro-Israel and pro-peace voices more than anyone else on the other side does not. And to that point, Michael, I want to wrap up in a few minutes because I know we're getting to time here, and I know you don't have very much of that on your hands. But I have two questions that I want to try to get to just quickly before you wrap up. The first one is, and I know this is a bit of a loaded one, but student unions. What role do student unions have to play in this? And what can we do to keep them accountable? Because I think a lot of times students think like, oh, student unions, like they're just a bunch of students just like me. But in reality, that's not the case. I mean, like they are very highly regulated. They are governed by a very specific set of rules. What can you tell us about student unions and what students can be doing to hold them more accountable?
So part of the issue with the student unions, at least from the ones that I've seen, is that they've been co-opted by people with very radical extreme views. Okay? And so they take those views and they turn them into action, which oftentimes the majority of the student body doesn't even agree with. But again, it takes a very special type of student to even want to get involved in the student union in the first place. Okay? It's not the type of thing that necessarily impacts, I mean, it does impact students' day-to-day life, but not necessarily enough that they want to do something tangible about it, okay? But I would say that, by the way, they're not as regulated as you think, okay? They are, a body of the government, and they're funded by the, partly, by the government. They're also funded by their universities and by the CEGEPs, okay? But what we've seen a lot happening is that the administration will typically say, well, it's not us, it's the union, it's a union issue, it's not for us, okay? My best advice on this is that more students need to get in the game and run for their student union. And then after they run for their student union, okay, they have to be willing to go to meetings, and they have to be willing to speak up at meetings, okay, and to propose resolutions at meetings, okay, and actually push the envelope.
Yeah, I mean,
democratically, it's a democratic process.
So this is, to be clear, like a huge focus for us at Stand With Us, and from my perspective, like the biggest way for us to move the needle is to get students into student government, and that's something that has to happen, and it takes time. It's like you said before, it's you chip away at this thing, and I think that's a message I want to really leave everybody with, is that like even when it is through legal recourse, nothing happens overnight. I actually had somebody call me the other day. This is maybe very personal story for the podcast, but they called about making a donation to Stand With Us Canada, and he says to me, "Well, how long have you been operating for?" And I said, "It's going to be 13 years." And he said, "Wait, 13 years? You're not new?" And I said, "No." And he goes, "Well, what have you done to make a difference? Nothing's changed in 13 years. Clearly your work is ineffective." And I said to the guy, I mean, look, I respect your opinion as much as I do anyone else, but this is not a fight that is won overnight in 1 year or in a decade. This is generational change that has to be made, and it starts with education, and it starts with teaching people that it's okay to speak up, it's okay to be proud of your identity. And I think that comes to to this theme and to this conversation really nicely, is that it's scary to go down a road and to start legal action, even something as simple as a demand letter. It feels very daunting, but people should know that they're well supported by smart, intelligent people like you, by hardworking, robust organizations like ours, and that they have the opportunity to venture down this road in a way that is safe and that's comfortable and that will keep them protected as best as possible, but also make meaningful change for the people around them. And more importantly, to the point of the fact that this is not something that's going to change overnight, to the future generations, to anyone thinking of starting a family down the road, to people who have nieces and nephews. Like, we are fighting not just for the survival of the Jewish people in the West, but for the survival of Western freedoms and democracies, And so I try to impress that upon a lot of our young people, to say that, you're not doing this for yourself. You're not even doing it for the Jews. You're doing it for everybody. And so on that note, Michael, I always like to wrap up with a little bit of hope, but with you, I'm going to take it a bit of a different direction. I'm going to ask you, many big lawyers, you're fortunate you're a name managing partner at your firm, but a lot of lawyers work at these, massive firms where they fear professional consequences of doing stuff like you're doing. If you can share a hopeful message to those lawyers about why they can and should get involved, what would that message be?
So look, I mean, you nailed it. Okay, there's a reason why I'm doing it, and not every single lawyer in Montreal is doing it. Everybody has their own reasons. That's definitely one of them. I've seen it myself. But what they can do, honestly, is just support our students. Support them on an individual level. Support them on an emotional level. Support them just on an I stand with you level as human beings. Forget about as lawyers. Okay. One thing that I've seen and that I've done in doing this that's been very meaningful to me, okay, is actually being able to support and empower our students and watch how a lot of them walk away from the situation after let's say Neil and I have been done with it. And I mean, obviously they appreciate the help that we gave, but a lot of the feedback that we get is that we really actually help them, empower them to like stick up for themselves, okay? And that anybody can do, okay? Anybody, any human being can do that, regardless of whether they're a lawyer or not, okay? And that's kind of the message that I would have, is just, like, be there for people on a human level. That's it.
Just to find a way, if you really can't do it legally, professionally, like, find another way to just to chat with them, to, like you said, to make them feel supported. You could have legal conversations without giving legal advice. You can give a student, this does sound like something you could pursue, or, whatever it might be, but it's just about finding a way. So,
I mean, I built a practice over, chatting with people on the phone who call me. I have a policy, actually, that normally, unless I see that, like, my time's really being abused, okay, if somebody calls me with a legal question, okay, I typically try and help them out for a few minutes. And, if it's a simple thing or whatever, I'll give them 5-10 minutes of my time, because, like, I find a lot of meaning in helping people. So, just find that meaning in helping people, and you'll see that it's very meaningful.
Yeah, just find a way to do it in a way that means something to you. Michael, thank you so much. I hope that for any of our legal professionals in Canada who are listening, that they felt inspired by hearing from you and from your story. And I encourage them to reach out to us so that we know of their, willingness to help, and that we can direct students their way if need be, because we're dealing with intake of, every day we have a call for somebody that needs something. And like you said, it isn't always justified or warranted, but we want to have the people that we can pass it off to when we can. So, Michael, thank you for being here. More importantly, thank you for everything that you're doing day to day. We're super, super grateful, and I know the country and the Jewish community around the globe. I'm not trying to be dramatic. Like, this is a big thing. So thank you very much for everything that you do. Thanks for taking the time, and I'm sure our paths will continue to cross as we work to support students around Montreal. Thanks, Michael.
I'm sure. Thanks, Jesse.